The Beatles had spent almost their entire life dedicated to creating sounds that changed music and pop culture forever. Apart from just music, the Fab Four were active in other social areas of their lives. The iconic music stars lived out some of the wild, crazy stories ever heard. From the Jelly Bean incident to when they wanted to buy an island, and to the story with the Apple Boutique, the Beatles are known for weird stories. They might be known for weird stories and their love for music, but they were not all that athletic. The story about the relay race that circulated was not all that easy. Do you think the Beatles were involved in a relay race? What do you think could have spurred them to get involved in a relay race? We'll dive right into this detail. But before we do so, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more exclusive content on the Beatles. The Beatles were not just a band, they were more like friends or brothers that did virtually everything together. There were certain times it was alleged that if a particular Beatle was caught doing something, the other members of the band would also be involved at least 70%. According to biographer Bob Spitz, there was a time when the Fab Four smoked hundreds of cigarettes a day. While it didn't seem to affect their voices, all that tar and nicotine took their toll on their health. All of them suffered from one ailment or the other. Even George Harrison admitted that all those cigarettes contributed to his fatal lung cancer. Regardless of their habits and other social activities, the Beatles were eager to show off their sporting skills. It was on the 11th of May, 1965. The Beatles were on location, wrapping up filming their second movie, Help. The Help director, Richard Lester, was to film a few atmospheres and scenery shots in London the next day, and after that, the 55 days of filming, Help, would officially come to an end. They were filming at Cliveden House, a 19th century mansion in Maidenhead, Berkshire. Cliveden House was doubling as Buckingham Palace in these scenes. When the four weren't filming, they were goofing off and playing softball until someone on the crew challenged them to a relay race. The Beatles had involved themselves with so many activities while they were on this particular set. They had even gone ahead to divulge some personal information about themselves, but nobody had suspected them to be on the athletic side. It was during this shoot that all four of them, Ringo, Paul, John, and George, openly admitted to smoking and indulging in marijuana use, relatively frequently, if not daily. It felt like they were addicted to it already. Besides the marijuana indulgence, the Beatles also liked their meals and enjoyed fine food. John Lennon was to call this his Fat Elvis period, as well as remember it as his steak and whiskey era. The iconic musicians, however, accepted the challenge owing to how adventurous they were. However, the race was to be around Cliveden Gardens, outside of and around Cliveden House. There were 4 separate relay teams, each team consisting of 6 members. Besides the Beatles team, there were the electricians, the carpenters, and the camera operators, who were divided into 4 groups. The Beatles team consisted of the Fab Four, plus the road manager, Neil Aspinall, and their chauffeur, Alf Bicknell. They took position, and when somebody shouted go, the sprinters took off, tearing their way around the Cliveden House and through the garden. What was the race like? John, Paul, George, Ringo, Neil, and Alf were to be the victors in the once-in-a-lifetime race that, according to Paul, was 15 furlongs, just under 2 miles. According to Paul, the runners covered at least a mile, and, believe it or not, the Beatles won. Paul also said the Beatles were very proud of the relay race victory. Thanks to a visiting American DJ who brought along a camera, you can see the race for yourself on the Help album on a DVD. After the race, Houston disc jockey Buddy McGregor spent time chatting casually with the Beatles and asking them questions about the just concluded relay race and other things. The questions and answers segment was more like an interview. The discussion had centered around the race before moving on to lollies and other things. Houston sure took his time in getting them to answer a few things that day. This was how the interview went, with Houston starting it up. He started by saying, "Quite a race was run on the lawn here at the Astor Mansion today, and the Beatles did win, as I told you earlier. And I have Paul and John here. You ran a very good race." Paul was quick to reply with a, "Thank you very much, thank you." Houston continued asking if Paul had ever participated in a relay race before. Paul answered in the affirmative, stating that he had run a relay race back then, since school days. He claimed he had not done any since, but he had done some now. The interview continued with both of them trying to measure the distance of the race. It was quite a long course out there, and Paul opined that it could be up to 15 furlongs. The interviewer thought there were a lot of good running back there and asked Paul if he thought he did his share. Paul responded by saying, "Well, you see, the best team won." Houston, however, moved to John asking if he had any comments, and his response was negative. They, however, distressed a bit and moved on to talk about Americans, Spanner, Monkey Wrench, and even John's new book. Houston asked, "And so, your new book called Spaniard in the Works is a play on the word spanner?" John said, "Yes, we're playing with spanners." Laughs. Just me laughing. The interviewer wanted to know if he had anything to do with a monkey wrench, and John replied by saying, "No, it's just about a fella. There's just a drawing of him with cars, you see. It's nothing about cars. He's a Spaniard working on a farm." He, however, helped lighten up the mood further as everyone laughed and asked, "What is that?" Everyone had a different opinion about what it was. John called it a Whopper, while Houston said they called it popsicles at home. Paul had a different opinion though, called it icicles. John added saying it was also called either lolly ices or Jerry. The argument, however, stretched on for a longer period. The film crew was so confident they could win since all the Beatles smoked and hardly got involved in any exercise. The Beatles won though, with collective effort and teamwork. Ringo's speed was particularly commented upon. People had forgotten how adept the Beatles were at escaping from fans and how necessary the extra burst of speed was in potentially life-threatening situations. There was a particular incident that happened where the Beatles had to run from the stage while performing. It was the Jelly Bean incident. The Beatles had just arrived in America, as then that should be in 1964. The musicians had sparked a wild tide of mass hysteria that we all know as Beatlemania. Over 75 million people tuned in to watch their performance on The Ed Sullivan Show. And when they showed up in Washington, D.C., they had to rent the entire 7th floor of the Shoreham Hotel to escape their frenzied fans. The Beatles were known to go on music tours till they split up. During their 34-day tour, the band played at Carnegie Hall and San Francisco's Cow Palace. But perhaps their most painful performance was at the Coliseum in DC. A boxing arena, however, prepared them a bit for the relay race. Before their performance, the Beatles had been interviewed by the New York Times, and George commented on how much he liked Jelly Babies. The starstruck fans, wanting to do something pleasant for their idols, loaded their pockets with jelly beans and hurled them at the stage, hitting the band from every side. The candies hit their guitar strings, pinged against Ringo's cymbals, and smacked them in their faces. There was a huge misunderstanding. Looks like a lot of fans had misinterpreted what George said in his interview. Jelly beans are not the same thing as jelly babies. Jelly babies are soft, while the beans are pretty hard. George was worried he might go blind that day. The fans kept hurling the jelly beans at them on stage. They used things to block themselves while running to seek shelter. This felt like a life-threatening situation they had to run from. Fortunately, the Fab Four made it through, battered but alive, and went on to play another day. It's safe to say they were already used to running from incidents that winning a relay race became little for them. After they won the race, Lord and Lady Astor presented the winning team, the Beatles, the road manager, and chauffeur, a bottle of vintage champagne. There is no record of exactly when the race took place during the day, whether before the day's shoot was finished, during the lunch break, at the end of the day, or during a wrap celebration. However, the relay race was filmed. Sadly, the footage has never been released to the public all these years. If the video was released to the public, lots of fans would have loved to watch it. That's all for today's video, guys. But before we end, do you think the Beatles were athletic people? Would you have loved to see the relay race? Were the Beatles right to accept the challenge? Let us know what you think in the comment section below. And if you haven't by now, ensure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new updates about the Beatles.